Baseball might be called America's pastime, but football is a more popular sport. According to a 2023 Gallup poll, 41% of Americans said that football was their favorite sport to watch. Only 10% said baseball. But football, especially professional American football, didn't really become popular until after the Second World War, when the marriage of television to the National Football League made professional football an integral part of the fabric of American culture. But the National Football League might not even have existed were it not for war. Young Americans, including many collegiate and professional players, brought the game with them when they went to both world wars, where they played a critical role in both the development and the popularization of American football, and played some very fun games that deserve to be remembered. American football had its origins in the 19th century. A match played between Rutgers and Princeton in 1869 is generally identified as the first football game, although it didn't look much like the modern game. The ensuing decade saw the sport developed in colleges on the East Coast with more modern rules. In 1982, the system of downs was established along with the line of scrimmage. It wasn't until 1906 that the forward pass was introduced. By the time of the First World War, the game had become popular at the collegiate level, and professional play was becoming increasingly common, if still disorganized. When the U.S. entered the war, the sport nearly disappeared stateside as players joined the expeditionary forces en masse. Initially, it looked like the war might end football's rise before it began. Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, the big three of collegiate football at the time, all dropped the sport. But instead of failing, the sport took on a new life in the training camps and military bases across the country, and eventually across the Atlantic. According to the book War Football, World War I and the Birth of the NFL by journalist Chris Serb, more than 50 college football Hall of Famers, dozens of future generals, and 2 Medal of Honor winners would play for or coach military teams during the World War I era. Walter Camp, called the father of American football, wrote during the war that war, whatever it may have done in wrecking college schedules, has brought about a far wider dissemination of football as a sport than all the exhortations of those who have advocated to play for larger numbers have ever been able to accomplish. The war provided the foundation for the NFL, formed less than 2 years after the war ended. The extent to which football grew among the armed forces is clear from an article in the New York Times published on November 23, 1919. This year we will have 2 seasons, one in the winter and early spring in France and Germany, and the usual college season in the United States, ending with November. Of the 2, the continental season will have more thrills, more ecstatic moments. The American Expeditionary Forces played football as they had fought. Never was there such enthusiasm, such elation, such rapture as marked the changing tide of battle in those contests of American soldiers. According to the article, hundreds of teams formed during the war, and in the aftermath of the armistice, General Order No. 241 announced a variety of athletic championships, with football first among them. Teams representing units played for championship status, with the team representing the 89th Division taking the top spot. In the years that followed, more than 240 war football players, including 7 Hall of Famers, would fill the NFL roster as it grew into a professional sport. While the NFL struggled in the interwar years and the Great Depression, the interwar years are seen as a golden age of collegiate football, and the sport grew in popularity. The Rose Bowl became an annual tradition starting in 1916. The Heisman Trophy was first awarded in 1935 to Jay Berwanger, also the first player to ever be drafted into the 1936 NFL Draft, although he decided to decline the offer and never played professionally. By World War II, football was on a much stronger footing, although it remained considerably less popular than baseball. More men were familiar with the sport than they had been before World War I, meaning there were plenty of players, both professional and collegiate, to play. One football writer predicted that 1942 would see the greatest participation in the history of the sport, as teams formed at Army camps and Navy bases. The military seemed to agree. Secretary of the Navy William F. Knox said in a speech in December 1944 that he didn't know anything that better prepares a man in peace for bodily contact, including war, and especially the kind of war we've got to fight in the Pacific, than the kind of training we get on the football field. In the autumn of 1942, the War Department began promoting organized football exhibitions, selecting teams from its military bases that played against what was left of collegiate teams stateside, including such teams as the Camp Detrick Army Chemists, the Beaumont General Hospital Raiders, and the Camp Peary Pirates, because don't all good stories involve pirates? The Coast Guard even had teams like the Alameda Coast Guard Sea Lions. These teams played throughout the war, generally against college teams. Sports Illustrated writer Charles Einstein wrote that the college football shifted to teams representing various Army, Navy, and Marine installations. As schools dropped the sport, the service teams began being included in national rankings and Associated Press polls. The Iowa Pre-Flight Sea Halls even managed to rank second in the AP poll. In 1942, in an effort to increase support for the war, the military formed two all-star teams, each representing the East and West, to play NFL teams and raise funds for the Army Emergency Fund. The military teams were made up of NFL players and college stars, with the Eastern team led by Lieutenant Colonel Robert Neyland, former head coach for Tennessee, while Major Wallace Wade of Duke University coached the Western All-Army Stars. The Western team played the Washington Redskins on August 30th, 1942, losing 26-7 in front of a crowd of 50,000, according to the United Press. They lost 3 of their 5 games, but did beat the Detroit Lions 12-0 and the Cardinals 16-10. The Eastern All-Army team only played 3 games, but defeated both the New York Giants and the Brooklyn Dodgers. Yes, there was a football team as well. They raised over $240,000 for the fund. But soldiers and soldiers in training didn't only play stateside. In November 1942, servicemen played a football game in Ireland, the first game of American football ever played on the island. It was part of a series of games dubbed European Theater of Operations Championships, played by a variety of teams with names like Yarvard and Hale, playing off of Harvard and Yale, as well as the Navy Galloping Gales, the 4th Infantry Blues, and Moore's Maulers. These games were played between 1932 and 1944 with a variety of bowl games, most often turkey bowls as they were played around Thanksgiving, as well as the Tea Bowl, Fog Bowl, and the Coffee Bowl. Many were played to raise money for organizations like the Red Cross. Most of these games were played in the UK, where relative safety allowed for that kind of organized recreation, but not all of them were played in the UK or even in Europe. On January 1st, 1944, with North Africa secured by Allied forces, the Army and Navy put together teams which played in Oran, Algeria. The New York Times reported 15,000 attendees, from privates to generals and from French officials to Arab chieftains. The Army beat the Navy 10-7 with a late-game field goal in what was dubbed the Arab Bowl. In December the following year, soldiers in Florence, Italy, prepared to celebrate the new year in a special game meant to give soldiers a break and a taste of home. Soldiers from the 5th Army took on members of the 12th Air Force in a game played only 3 hours jeep ride from the front. The game was played in front of an audience of 25,000 GIs, WACs, and Army nurses, with a full USO show at halftime. The men cheered 2 pretty bold queens and booed when the drum majorette tried to cover her legs from the cold. The Army team, which called itself the Kraut Clouters, played the Army Air Force Bridge Busters. The Army had several players who had played professionally. Cecil Sturgeon, who played with the Philadelphia Eagles, and Los Angeles Mustangs fullback John Big Six Moody. Women service members rode on a variety of floats, and the USO show included Peggy Jean Roan, who claims America's freestyle baton twirling title. High-profile attendees included Ella Logan, an actress and singer, Leo the Lip Duracker, manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers, and Ducky Medwick, New York Giant outfielder. It was branded as the first and last Spaghetti Bowl and played at Stadio Giovanni Berta. The Army team even had a mule for a mascot, named Little May. The game itself was full contact, and Corporal Moody was the MVP from the segregated 92nd Division. The Buffalo Soldier led the team to victory. Moody had played in college with the Morris Brown College Wolverines as a fullback and place kicker, scoring 109 points in 1940 and setting a record for black colleges for career points with 240. In 1942, he played with the Fort Knox Armor Raiders in a charity game against the Pittsburgh Steelers. At the Spaghetti Bowl, he played possibly the best game of his life. The New York Times reported he generally roamed the field at will. Moody scored first in the second quarter as he banged through guard in response to the Army's chant, "We won a touchdown!" And then he kicked the extra point. In the third quarter, Moody intersected a pass on the Air Force's 15-yard line for a second touchdown and kicked the extra point again. The third touchdown for the Army was a pass to Lieutenant Art Lemke. Moody kicked for the extra point again, but an offsides penalty meant it didn't count. A second offside discounted the second kick, and on the third kick, the ball was fumbled, but it was already over for the Air Force. There were reminders during the game that they remained in a war zone. P-38 Lightnings flew overhead, and the location of the game was kept a closely held secret until it was actually played. The Lincoln Journal-Star reported that the Luftwaffe had promised to interrupt the festivities, letting attendees know what it felt like to be a decoy on a duck pond. The article claimed that one German broadcast said it's going to be a great day for an air raid at Florence, while another reported that Nero fiddled while Rome burned and the 5th Army and 12th Air Force are going to play football while Florence burns. Fortunately for everyone, no German planes made their way to Florence that day. The Spaghetti Bowl, while the most prominent, wasn't the only football game played in Europe on New Year's Day in 1945. In Marseille, a crowd of 18,000 watched the Railway Shop Battalion unit play the Army All-Stars in the Riviera Bowl, while the Coffee Bowl 3 was held in London. The Army took the prize at the Spaghetti Bowl, bronze medals and a trophy full of paper spaghetti, winning 20-0. While considerably less common, football games were played in the Pacific too. By far the most famous took place on Guadalcanal, Christmas Eve, 1944. The game started as a boast between bored Marines over who would win if they played football. The players were drawn from 2 Marine units, the 4th versus the 29th Regiments, recently combined into the 6th Marine Division, slated for the invasion of Okinawa. The roster was impressive. John McLaughlin, one of the players, bragged to his dad that the 4th Regiment could play against the NFL championship-winning Chicago Bears. Between the two teams, 65 players were on the roster. 56 of them had played college football, and 22 of those were starters. 16 had either been drafted or received offers before they enlisted. 3 were All-Americans. The two teams would play on an improvised field of gravel and coral, playing two-hand touch above the waist rules, although full-on tackling was common anyway. The 29th, better organized, challenged the 4th to a warm-up round in early December. Without time to practice between training, the 4th could only cobble together a team, but they held the 29th to a no-score tie. A week before the bowl game was to take place, the 4th played another scrimmage between an all-star team and the 4th Regimental Weapons Company. After 3 quarters, the Weapons Company scored a safety, ending the game 2-0. The all-star team, set to play the 29th, invited 5 members of the company to join their team. It isn't exactly clear where the name Mosquito Bowl came from. It might have come from the Mosquito Network, an amateur radio station put together by some Marines with broadcasting experience. And it had connections to the Armed Forces radio services, allowing it to broadcast all over the Pacific. The network worked hard to create hype by broadcasting information about the game. The 29th had a more experienced team. The 4th had about 10 players who had only played in high school. According to Buzz Bissinger, who wrote a book about the game, the Las Vegas consensus had the 29th as an easy favorite. McLaughlin, who led the 4th team, had a strategy to keep bringing in new players, hoping to keep his guys fresh in the tropical heat. It ought to be quite a brawl, McLaughlin said. The game was big news, receiving coverage in numerous state-sized newspapers despite the far-off setting. The young Marines of the 6th Division did not play softly. One claimed it was the roughest game he'd ever played. Another likened it to an alley fight. The rough field shredded clothes and left the men with cuts and bruises. And despite the hard playing, the final was 0-0. For the men of the 6th Division, the reminder that they were in a war came most brutally 4 months later, when they landed on Okinawa. Within 6 months of the game, more than 12 of those players were dead, and another 20 wounded. It might seem downright silly to play football in a war zone, but for troops overseas who are constantly training and under the threat of combat and death, a football game could be a rare moment where they could forget about the weight of the war hanging over them and maybe even for a moment imagine that they were home. Even watching a football game could be a welcome respite from the monotony of training. The troops continued playing even after the war was over. In 1945, in order to raise the morale of Marines that were stationed in Nagasaki over Christmas and New Year, the Army went to one of the few athletic fields that had been cleared of rubble and played what they called the Atomic Bowl. Even today, U.S. forces that are stationed overseas will commonly participate in fantasy football leagues, football watch parties, and even entire leagues that are built around flag football. A little taste of home while you are over there. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.